As parents, we rarely think about how we would explain death to a young child. We usually wait until something happens, and then we find ourselves a bit unprepared and caught in the dilemma of what to say. Now, let's hear from Doris Zagdanski, author and educator on all things grief. Doris, why is it so hard to talk about death, especially to young children?
It's particularly hard for parents because what they want to often do is protect their children from the whole subject of death, loss, grief, funerals, sadness. They think they're often just too young to understand and it will just harm them. I'd actually like to read you something that was written by a mother who found herself with this dilemma of how to speak to her 3-year-old daughter about the death of her little sister. Undoubtedly, the hardest task I ever had to do as a parent was to tell my 3-year-old daughter that her baby sister had died suddenly in the night. The task was difficult, not only because of my own sense of shock and grief, but because I was totally unaware of how to tell her. What were the right words for someone so young? Would the truth be too brutal? Would she even be able to comprehend? She'd never known anyone before who died. Should she see me crying? Would the idea of death and the funeral frighten her? Nothing in my life experience had prepared me for this task. Not my upbringing, not my education, and not my beliefs. So I did what came naturally as a good mother. I decided to protect my daughter from this scary thing called death. I chose the soft approach. Your sister got sick in the night and an ambulance came to take her to hospital and she can't come home anymore. Technically, this was a fair summary of what had occurred, but I just happened to leave out the important part, the words that said her sister had died. I just couldn't say them. While we attended the funeral, she played with her cousins. She didn't get to say goodbye. Her sister just disappeared forever. As the months passed, she asked lots of questions. Can we go to see her? When is she coming home? Has the doctor made her better yet? Little by little, the truth started to come out. I'm not sure exactly how old she was when she learned the full story, but I do know I had to untell the stories I told at the beginning. Now that young mother was me 30 years ago. I can still remember it like it was yesterday, but what I remember most of all was the anxiety that I faced in not knowing how to do this task, probably as a mum, one of the most important tasks I ever would have to do. They say grief is a teacher. Well, I learned I had a lot of lessons to learn.
So, should we use the actual words dead and death?
The words dead and death are household words. Children hear them all the time. They see dead birds in the garden, dead insects, dead flowers in a vase. We say things like dead scared, dead tired, drop dead gorgeous. They're not words that children haven't heard before. The difference is, though, when someone's died, is that they have to learn that dead is about people and that it happens to somebody that they know.
So how could you explain death to a small child?
You need to use words that are simple and appropriate for their age. You could say something like this. When you die, your heart stops working and so you can't breathe, and that's what keeps you alive. They can't move anymore, they can't talk, they can't play, they don't eat, they can't open their eyes. Their whole body stops working. This is what we mean when we say someone is dead.
Sometimes you hear adults say that dead is like sleeping. Is that a good idea?
We need to get something straight. Dead is nothing like sleeping. It just confuses and even frightens children. The thought of going to sleep and not waking up is really scary. We do similar things when we say something like, "We lost Grandma in the night." For a child, they're used to losing toys and things around the house, and they often just think, well, if she's lost, we can go out and find her. Sometimes we say things like, "Grandma's gone to be with the angels." Again, for a child, it might sound like Grandma's just left and doesn't want to be with them anymore, or that the angels took her away, or where did they take her to? All of these stories might sound soft and they might sound gentle, but they're fantasy, and very often they just confuse children. Children only hear the words that we actually said, not what we meant underneath.
Children often want to know why people die. How do we get them to understand?
The explanations need to sound logical and make sense according to their logic. We need to say something like, sometimes people die because they are very, very, very sick. Sometimes there might be a really bad accident and their body is so badly hurt that the doctors can't make it better. We could say, sometimes people die and we just don't know why it happened. Most times people die because they are very, very, very old and their body gets worn out. Sometimes people die and they are not old, but there was something wrong inside their body. The rule is no fairy tales.
Parents often wonder if they should take children to funerals. Should the children go?
When children are part of the goodbyes, they don't have to wonder what happened to the person. We need to explain, though, what they're going to see and what's going to happen at a funeral. Children need to have a picture before they attend. So we need to say something like this. We're going to a funeral because that's where we say goodbye to Grandma. We need to say that, there'll be speeches, there'll be music, there'll be people who might be sad. You could even say your mummy might be sad, but you don't have to worry if I cry. It's because I'm going to miss Grandma. But there's something else we have to talk about. We have to let them know there's going to be a casket or a coffin there. And we've got to tell them what that is. And again, we say it in simple words. A coffin is like a long box, and it's made especially for someone who has died. That's where we put their body. And it has a lid on it, and it keeps them safe. The idea is to prepare them for what they will see, and to let them know it's all right to ask questions.
Burial seems a bit more straightforward, but would you tell a child that their grandma was cremated?
Yes, burial is definitely easier, and all we need to do is say something like this. After the funeral, we're going to bury the coffin in the ground, in a place that we call the cemetery. But cremation is a bit harder. We spend most of our time as parents telling children to stay away from fire, don't touch fire, fire's going to hurt them. And I think for children who are really young, we don't have to tell them the whole story. We can simply say, Grandma's coffin is going to a place called the crematorium. That could be enough for children. For those who are a little bit older, we might say, at the crematorium, the coffin is turned into ashes, and we can put those wherever we like. We can bury them in a place that's special to us. That's all we need to say for young children. As they get older, they'll be able to manage more information. If they're missing information, they're just going to fill it in with their imagination or what they see on TV, and rarely is that close to the real truth of what's happened.
Should children see someone who has died, for example, at a viewing?
The same rules apply as with a funeral. If children are going to go to a viewing, they need to be told beforehand what they are going to see. They need to know the person's going to be in a coffin. They need to know that they'll be dressed in their favourite clothes. They'll need to know that they're going to be cold if they want to touch them. They also need to know that the people who are going might be sad, and they're sad because of saying goodbye. I think if we can normalise these sorts of things, children will understand what they're going to expect when they go along too. I'd like to illustrate that with a story about a family who once asked me if their grandchildren should go to see their granddad. Granddad had died suddenly, most unexpectedly, and the children were aged around 5, 6, 7, perhaps up to about 10 or 11. And the parents didn't want them to see Granddad. They said to me that it was best if they just remembered him the way he was. And in talking about that, they said to me, well, could you explain to the children what the viewing is, and then we'll let them decide if they go. So we gathered the children around, there were perhaps 5 or 6 of them, and I explained to them what they were going to see and where Granddad would be. And then I added something and I said, you know, if you should come along with Mum and Dad, you can actually bring something for your Granddad. You know, you might want to leave something with him inside the coffin. And that really sparked their imagination. So on the appointed day, the children came along with their parents, and they were carrying their little plastic bags all filled with something special for Granddad. So we took the children in, and there was Granddad lying in his coffin, and they said to their parents, can we just be here and talk to Granddad ourselves? So we adults left and the children spent some time, and after a little while I went in to see how Granddad was doing, and he'd been completely transformed. Around his neck he was wearing a blue and white striped football scarf, and I said to one of the children, tell me who gave him this. And this little boy said, well, Granddad took me to the footy every week when we played at home, and so I want him to have a scarf to take with him. And then pinned here on Granddad's suit was one of those ribbons that you win for swimming or athletics. And I said, now who put that there? And this little boy, maybe about 7 or 8, said, Granddad always watched me swim, and I won this at the swimming sports, and so I thought I'd give him my ribbon. But right here in the middle of his chest was my favourite thing. It was a malt biscuit. And I said, now who gave Granddad the biscuit? And a little 5, 6-year-old piped up and he said, I put that there. And I said, why did you do that? And he said, well, when Granddad came to Mummy and Daddy's place, Mummy always made him a cup of tea with a malt biscuit. And if he's going to heaven, he might as well take one with him. And for me, that was a story that illustrates to parents that we could keep children away from funerals and from viewings because we think it's going to harm them. But if we can help them to see it's okay to talk to someone who's died, it's okay to touch them, it's okay to reminisce about them, sometimes the experience might not actually be as scary as we adults think.
Sometimes parents hide their emotions from their children. They don't want them to be upset. Is that a good idea?
One way that children learn how to cope with their feelings is by watching what their parents are doing. So if adults don't cry because they think it will harm their children, or if adults say things like, you know, big boys don't cry, or if adults don't talk about the person who's died or what's happened, children learn very quickly that the way we deal with loss and grief is to not talk about it. It doesn't help children if they see adults in uncontrollable grief, but for children to see mum or dad crying, to hear them talking about what's happened, to hear them say, you know, I'm going to miss my mum, you know, we're going to miss Nana, to have them reminisce about favourite times, things they used to do together, and to let them know that it's okay to talk about the person even though they've died. These are all good lessons for children to learn. And I'd like to perhaps illustrate it with a story of my own, going back to my daughter who died. And the story goes like this. One day I was sitting in my kitchen at home, having what I thought was a very private cry to myself. I was getting ready to cook dinner, and I was feeling particularly sad and a little bit teary, and my 5-year-old daughter walked in and she looked at me and she said, "Mummy, are you crying?" And I guess mummies have options. I could have said something like, "Oh, don't be silly, I'm peeling onions," or "I've got hay fever," or something like that. But I chose to tell the truth, and I said, "Yes, I am crying." And she said, "Why are you sad?" And I said, "Well, your sister who died, it would be her birthday this week. And whenever I think about her at times like that, I wonder what we'd be doing, and would we be having a party, and I'd be making her a birthday cake." And I was in the kitchen thinking all about those things, and it just made me cry. Well, little Miss 4, 5 looked at me and she just said very sympathetically, "Oh, Mummy." And off she toddled to her room. About 15, 20 minutes later, she came back and she said to me, "Look, Mummy, I've made you a new Claire." And she brought this out and she handed it over and she said, "Look, but let me tell you about her first." She said, "I know Claire had black hair like Daddy, but she's an angel in heaven now, so I gave her lots of white hair." And then she said, "Look, Mummy, she's got a big smile on her face. She's not sad." And then she handed her over to me and she said, "I want you to have this new Claire, so that when her birthday comes, you won't be lonely without her." Well, as you could imagine, by now I'm bawling my eyes out and I'm trying to say something like, "This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." And I went to put her down on the kitchen bench like this and I said, "I'm going to put Claire here in the kitchen with me, so she can be here for the whole week of her birthday." And my little daughter said, "Oh, Mummy," she said, "she can't stand up." And she lay her down on the bench like this and she said, "She's dead. She has to lie down." And there she lay for the week of her birthday. What this tells me is that children can cope with stories about their little sister who's died. Children can cope with seeing their parents sad and tearful. But what children can't cope with all that easily is missing information, the stuff that lets their imaginations run rampant. So we as parents have a duty, and our duty is to help our children bear both facts and feelings when they're coping with grief.